Chapter 11 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 11. Charles Francis Hall and the North Pole. Among the many exploring expeditions that have crossed the Arctic Circle with the sole view of reaching the North Pole, one only has sailed entirely under the auspices of the United States. This expedition was commanded neither by an officer of one of the twin military services nor by a sailor of the merchant marine, but its control was entrusted to a born Arctic explorer, Charles Francis Hall. Born in 1821 in Rochester, New Hampshire, Hall early quitted his native hills for the freer fields of the West, as the Ohio Valley was then called, and later settled in Cincinnati. There was never a spirit of change in him, and as years rolled on, he passed from blacksmith to journalist, from stationer to engraver. Through all these changes of trades he held fast to one fancy, which in time became the dominating element of his eventful career. In early youth, fascinated with books of travel relating to exploration in the icy zones, he eagerly improved every opportunity to increase his Arctic library, which steadily grew despite his very limited resources. His interest in the fate of Franklin was so intense that he followed with impatience the slow and uncertain efforts for the relief of the lost explorer. Not content with mere sympathy, he also planned an American search, to be conducted in Her Majesty's ship Resolute. Learning in 1859 that this Arctic ship was laid up and dismantled, he originated a petition asking that it be loaned for such purpose. The return of McClintock with definite news of the death of Franklin and the retreat and loss of his expeditionary force put an end to the petition. Hall, however, despite the admirable and convincing report of McClintock, persisted in the belief that some members of Franklin's crew were yet alive, and he determined to solve the problem by visiting King William Land, the scene of the final disaster. He issued circulars asking public aid, diligently sought out whalers and explorers who could give him their personal experiences, and finally determined that he must go and live with the Eskimo, and, conforming to their modes of travel and existence, work out his Arctic problem on new lines. The inauguration of the plan presented difficulties, for Hall was without means, but his persistent action created confidence, and the modest outfit for the voyage was procured through friendly contributions, while passage on a whaler for himself and baggage was tendered. On July 30, 1860, with a whaleboat and scanty supplies, Hall landed alone on the west coast of Davis Strait in Frobisher Bay. His base of operations was Rescue Harbor, 63° north, 65° west, whence he made a series of sledge journeys during the 2 years passed in this region. He re-examined the coasts visited by Frobisher in his eventful voyages of 1575 to 1579, and found the famous gold mine on Meta Incognita, whence 1,300 tons of ore were carried to England, where, as the chronicles relate, in the melting and refining 16 tons whereof proceeded 210 ounces of fine silver mixed with gold. An extensive collection of relics of Frobisher's expedition was made, which later was given to the Royal Geographical Society. The expedition of Hall was mainly fruitful in training him for other Arctic work, for though his knowledge was self-acquired and instruments imperfect, yet his indefatigable industry and practice in scientific observations made him a reliable observer by the time of his return. It may be added that his careful and detailed description of the habits and life of the Eskimo of the west coast of Davis Strait are of decided value from his rigid truthfulness, which caused him to record what he saw without exaggeration. Hall's success in obtaining so many relics of Frobisher's voyage of 3 centuries previous, and the fact that the Eskimo yet had traditionary knowledge of that voyage, encouraged Hall and his friends to a confident belief that a voyage to the shores of King William Land would result in the discovery of records, relics, possibly survivors, and in any event rescue the story of the retreat of Crozier from oblivion by hearing it from Eskimo eyewitnesses. Future search operations were to be promoted through his Eskimo followers, commonly known as Joe and Hannah, who returned with him to the United States, and further, Hall relied upon his knowledge of the Eskimo language, in which he had acquired considerable facility during his long sojourn with them. Hall's return was in 1862, and in 1864 he was ready for his second voyage. On August 20th he was landed, with his two natives, a whaleboat, tent, and a moderate amount of provisions, on Depot Island, in the extreme northern part of Hudson Bay, in 63° 47' north, 90° west, where Hall began his life and quest that were to last 5 weary years. Preliminary autumnal journeys extended his knowledge, but they were marked by no definite progress, and the summer of 1864 was spent by the natives in securing game for the coming winter, thus postponing Hall's chances of a westward sledge trip to King William Land yet another year. Despairing of assistance from natives near the whaling rendezvous, Hall decided to make his winter quarters in Repulse Bay at Fort Hope, 60° 32' north, 87° west, occupied 1846 47 by the famous explorer Dr. Rae. Here he hoped to secure the friendship of the neighboring Eskimo and lay up stores of game for the final expedition, and there he wintered in 1865 66, during which he secured about 150 reindeer, some salmon, and ptarmigan. With returning spring, the Eskimo promised to make the journey, and with quite a party and several dog sledges, Hall's heart was full of joy and expectation as they moved northward across Rae Peninsula. On March 30th, 1866, his discouragements commenced with the long halts and frequent detours for hunts, and his disappointment was complete when the natives decided to turn back from Cape Weynton, 68° north, 89° west, after having, in 28 days, only traveled as far with dogs as Rae had gone on foot in 5 days. Hall simply records, "My King William party is ended for the present, disappointed but not discouraged." The journey and time were not fruitless, for near Cape Weynton he fell in with 4 strange Eskimo, who gave him most valuable information as to the subject nearest his heart. They related that some of their people had visited the search ships and had seen Franklin. What was more to the point, they produced a considerable number of articles that had once belonged to members of Franklin's party. The most important were silver articles, such as spoons, forks, etc., which bore the crest of Franklin and other officers of the lost expedition. These veritable evidences of the passage of Crozier and others of Franklin's expedition through this region were fortunately secured by Hall, and were later supplemented by many others. Unable to obtain Eskimo assistance the following year, Hall made journeys here and there wherever it was possible, one in February, 1867, to Igloolik, the winter quarters of Perry, in 1822, on Boothia Felix Land, and a second in 1868 to the Strait of Fury and Hecla, discovered by Perry in 1825. Furthermore, he surveyed the northwest coast of Melville Peninsula, and filled in the broken line of the Admiralty chart for the northwest of that peninsula. Visiting whalers urged on Hall the impossibility of succeeding in reaching King William Land by aid of natives, and more than one captain offered to carry him and his party back to the United States. Never despairing of final success, Hall determined to pass another winter at Fort Hope, Repulse Bay. Here, learning by experience, and acquiring food supplies during the winter, he succeeded in March, 1869, in again starting westward with 10 Eskimo, men, women, and children, with well-loaded dog sledges. Progress was slow and delays frequent, but still the journey was continued. Their course from Repulse Bay lay overland, by nearly connecting lakes and rivers, across Rae Peninsula to Committee Bay, thence by another similar overland route over the south end of Boothia Felix Land to James Ross Strait, where King William Land lies some 60 miles to the west. Hall, singularly enough, was never able to appreciate the attitude of the natives in making such a long, dangerous journey merely to please him, for he quaintly complains that the Eskimo had no appreciation of his mission and continually lost valuable time by stopping to smoke and talk. They now objected to go west of Pelly Bay, but by persuasion proceeded to Simpson Island, 68 degrees 30' north, 91 degrees 30' west, where a successful hunt for musk oxen so restored their spirits that they went on. At Point Ackland, on the eastern shore of James Ross Strait, Hall fortunately fell in with natives, with whom he remained 9 days, and from whom he obtained important information. Inuk Po Ji Juk proved to be the chief man of the party, and from him and others were purchased relics, such as silver spoons, plain and with the crest of Franklin. Hall was told that these articles came from a large island where a great many white men died, and that 5 white men were buried on an island known to the chief. This Eskimo finally agreed to accompany Hall and guided him direct across James Ross Strait to a group of small islets to the east of King William Land, where, on Todd Island, part of a human thigh bone was found, snow covering the ground to such a depth as to make thorough search impossible without long delay. On May 12, 1869, Hall had the supreme pleasure of putting foot on King William Land, the object and end of his 5 years' life among the Eskimo. The only tangible result of the search thereon was the discovery of a human skeleton, and he reluctantly set out on his return. Eskimo were fallen in within Pelly Bay, 68 degrees 30' north, 90 degrees 30' west, and an old man, Tungnuk, on inquiry regarding Franklin relics in their possession, told Hall that the natives had found a ship beset near Kikituk, King William Land, and that in getting wood out of it they made a hole in the ship, which soon after sank. Kobig, another native, said that all the white men perished except 2 at Kikituk, whose fate was unknown. Hall felt satisfied, from the stories of the Eskimo and other evidences, that he was able to determine the fate of 79 out of the 105 men of Crozier's party, which retreated in 1848 from the abandoned ships. The Eskimo told him that Crozier, Franklin's second in command, had passed near their huts, that he had a gun in his hand and a telescope around his neck, and that his men were dragging 2 boats. Crozier told the natives that they were going to Repulse Bay. The Eskimo admitted that they had deserted Crozier owing to the fact that his party was in a starving condition and their food was scarce. As far as Hall could make out, Crozier, late in July, 1848, passed down the west coast of King William Land, with 40 men dragging 2 sledges, and near Cape Herschel fell in with 4 Eskimo families who, after communicating with Crozier, fled from the starving party during the night. From native accounts, Hall was also able to enumerate in detail the points at which the retreating party had died and been buried. Among other relics collected by Hall were portraits of one of the boats, an oak sledge runner, a chronometer box with the Queen's broad arrow engraved thereon, Franklin's mahogany writing desk, and many pieces of silver, forks, spoons, knives, and parts of watches. It was claimed by the natives that one of Franklin's ships made the Northwest Passage with 5 men on board, and in the spring of 1849 was found by them near O'Reilly Island, 88 degrees 30' north, 99 degrees west. Hall had now passed 5 years among the Eskimo, in which time he had made sledge journeys aggregating more than 3,000 miles, acquired a thorough knowledge of the language and methods of life of the natives, and proved the possibility of a white man living the same life and making the same sledge journeys as the natives. But at the same time he became conscious that no very extended sledge work could be done by Eskimo aid alone. His 5 years of arduous Arctic life ended in 1869 by his returning home on an American whaler, bringing with him his faithful Eskimo, Joe and Hannah. Hall's return to the United States was simply, however, to pursue another and greater voyage, in which he believed he would be able to reach the North Pole. After strenuous efforts, he succeeded in interesting the President, the Cabinet, and a large number of Congressmen in his project, and on July 12, 1870, Congress appropriated $50,000 for the purpose of the expedition, authorized the employment of any suitable vessel in the Navy, and provided that the National Academy of Sciences should prescribe the scope of the scientific observations. An old tug of nearly 400 tons burden, rechristened under the name of Polaris, was selected, overhauled, and strengthened. Hall sailed from New York June 29th, the party consisting of Captain Buddington, sailing master; Dr. Emil Bessel, chief of the scientific staff; R. W. D. Bryan, astronomer; Sergeant Frederick Meyer, signal corps; meteorologist; 7 petty officers, and a crew of 14, together with its faithful servants Joe and Hannah. The Polaris was provisioned and equipped for an absence of 2½ years, and her voyage was destined to be over the route made famous by the expeditions of Kane and Hayes, through Davis Strait and northward along the west coast of Greenland, although Hall was at first uncertain whether he would not enter Jones's Sound instead of Smith's Strait. The usual visits to the Greenland ports were made, with resulting stores of furs, dogs, sledges, and other paraphernalia for exploration in the far north. To this point the expedition was convoyed by the man of war Congress, which bade the Polaris Godspeed as she left Godhaven on her lonely journey. Hans Hendrik, the Eskimo dog traveler, whose services with Kane and Hayes commended him to Hall, accompanied the expedition with his wife and children. It was a strange meeting between Morton, the second mate, and Hans, the Eskimo, who, 20 years before, as subordinates of Kane, had made together the memorable sledge journey from Rensselaer Harbor along the Humboldt Glacier to Cape Constitution. The Polaris was favored by an unusually open sea. Melville Bay was crossed in 48 hours, and the north water beyond was so free of ice that the Polaris kept her way unchecked until she reached Hakluyt Island. Even here the ice pack was so open that the Polaris easily forced her way. Littleton Island was passed on the evening of August 27, 1870, and later, crossing the parallel of Rensselaer Harbor, the Polaris attained a higher latitude than any former vessel on this route. Kane Sea and Kennedy Channel proved equally free of ice, so that the Polaris, steaming uninterruptedly northward, entered the Arctic Ocean, hitherto inaccessible, where she was finally stopped by an impenetrable pack in 82° 26' north. This point was more than 200 miles directly north of the farthest reached by Kane's vessel, the Advance. From this vantage ground it was seen that the eastern coast line of Grinnell Land extended somewhat farther to the north before turning to the west, and that, on the other hand, the coast of northern Greenland trended very nearly eastward. Strenuous, though unavailing, efforts were made to push the Polaris further northward. Failing this, attempts were then made to find a safe harbor to the eastward, but none was accessible. In the meantime, the main ice pack of the Arctic Ocean, setting southward to its normal position, carried the Polaris steadily to the south, through Robinson Channel, a distance of nearly 50 miles, and nearly caused her destruction by forcing her on the Greenland coast. Fortunately, the pack opened somewhat, so that the vessel was enabled to change her position and secure safe anchorage. This place, later named Thank God Harbor, at 81° 37' north, 61° 44' west, was sheltered by a bold cape to the north, while the Polaris was protected from the polar pack by an immense ice floe called Providence Berg. This enormous floe berg, grounded in 100 fathoms of water, was by direct measurement 450 feet long, 300 feet broad, and towered 60 feet above the level of the sea. Preparations were at once made to put the crew in winter quarters, and on shore an observatory was built for scientific purposes. To the surprise and delight of the party, seals proved to be quite abundant, and a small herd of musk oxen was found, the first of these animals ever seen on the west coast of Greenland. Leaving his chief of the scientific staff and his sailing master to their respective duties, Hall decided on a preliminary sledge journey in order to determine the best route for his contemplated journey of the next spring toward the Pole. A heavy fall of snow ensured good sledging, and enabled him to leave Thank God Harbor on October 10th, he being accompanied by the first mate, Chester, the Eskimo, Joe, and Hans Hendrik, with 2 dog sledges and 14 dogs. In a journey of 6 days he attained Cape Brevoort, in 82° north, on the north side of Newman Bay, a considerable distance to the southward, however, of the point reached by the Polaris in the Arctic Ocean. In a dispatch written at this point, Hall says, "From Cape Brevoort we can see land extending on the west side of the strait to the north, a distance of about 70 miles, thus making land, as far as we can discover, about 83 degrees 5 minutes north. To illustrate the accuracy of Hall's judgment and his freedom from making extravagant claims, it may be stated that the detailed surveys of the British Arctic expedition of 1876 show the most northerly point on the east coast of Grinnell Land, Cape Joseph Henry, which possibly could be seen by Hall, was in 82 degrees 55 minutes, or within 10 miles of the position assigned it from a distance of 70 miles. Hall returned to the Polaris on October 24th, speaking most encouragingly of his prospects and planning another sledge journey for the autumn. Within an hour, however, he was taken violently ill, and upon examination Dr. Bessels announced that he had been stricken with apoplexy, that his left side was paralyzed, and that his sickness might prove fatal. After an illness with delirium for several days, he improved materially and was even able, through his clerk, to arrange the records of his late sledge journey, but a recurrence of the attack caused his death on November 8, 1871. The death of Hall left the expedition without a head. However, Captain Buddington, the sailing master, and Dr. Bessels, the chief of the scientific staff, signed an agreement to do all in their power to fulfill the ultimate object of Hall's ambition. Desultory efforts to go northward by boat were made without success the following year, and the only expedition which had definite result was one on foot by Sergeant Meyer of the Signal Corps of the United States Army, during which he reached Repulse Harbor, 82 degrees 9 minutes north, on the shores of the frozen Polar Sea, at that time the most northerly land ever attained. The future of the Polaris expedition does not strictly pertain to Hall. However, the winter was marked by a series of valuable physical observations made by Dr. Bessels and Mr. Bryan, the astronomer. In August, 1872, it was decided to return to the United States. Pushed into an impenetrable pack, anchored to a floe, the Polaris drifted with the main ice pack down Kennedy Channel, through Kane Sea, and into Smith Sound, where, on October 15, 1872, off Northumberland Island, the pack was disrupted by a violent gale, which freed the Polaris. Part of her crew, left upon the ice pack, experienced the horrors of a midwinter drift southward of 1,300 miles, and were picked up off the coast of Labrador by the sealer Tigress in the spring of 1872. The Polaris drifted to land in Lifeboat Cove, near Littleton Island, where the party built winter quarters on shore, known as Polaris House. In the succeeding summer they built boats from the remains of their ship, by means of which they reached Cape York, where the contemplated journey across Melville Bay was rendered unnecessary by falling in with the whaler Ravenscraig, which took them to England. The geographical results of Hall's last expedition were extensive and valuable. Not only was the Polaris navigated to the highest point then ever attained by a vessel, but the very shores of the Polar Sea were visited and explored. Hall carried northward and completed the exploration of Kennedy Channel, outlined the coast of Hall Basin and Robinson Channel, extended Grinnell Land northward nearly 2 degrees of latitude to practically its extreme limit, added materially to the northern limits of Greenland, and charted a very extensive portion of its northern coast. Unfortunately for the general credit of the expedition, the accurate observations and conservative estimates of Hall were not adhered to, and in their stead were published, under government auspices, a chart of Hall's discoveries which proved misleading in many of its details, extravagant and unreliable in its claim of new northern lands. The fidelity, accuracy, and importance of Hall's Arctic work is recognized, especially by his American and British successors in Smith Sound. Nares, in his official report to Parliament, states that the east coast line of Grinnell Land agreed so well with Hall's description that it was impossible to mistake their identity. Their bearing also, although differing upward of 30 degrees from those of the published chart, agreed precisely with his published report. Thus Hall merited the commemorative inscription on the brass tablet which the British Polar Expedition of 1875, with a generous appreciativeness creditable to its own brave men, erected to Hall's memory over his lonely northern grave. It recognizes Hall as one who sacrificed his life in the advancement of science, and further recites that they, following in his footsteps, have profited by his experience. Chapter 12. Recording by William Tomco.